Matthew, how you doing, man? Been a long time.
It has indeed, and very different times as well. So, but it's great to be connected again.
Yeah, I saw your new book come out. I got it right here. Business of Choice, second edition. I haven't gotten through the whole thing yet, but I read the first one twice, so I have a good understanding what's in there. I don't understand it all, but I have an understanding what you've covered.
You're being falsely modest. You are in any correspondence we've had. You've shown a very good grasp of insights from behavioral science and using the terminology. So I think you're kind of a great student in the area.
Well, you do realize I was a lobbyist for 15 years, so manipulation is kind of a core competency.
I prefer to call it influence.
But you know what? I was lobbying. I call a spade a spade. So I know you've spoken at a couple of our conferences, and you don't have a background in transportation, energy, any of that stuff. But I want to have a conversation with you today because I want to understand a little bit more about how people make decisions. And for me, it's within the context of what's going on in the transportation world. So let me just give a quick background, then we can start talking about how people might react to these things. The global community is now pushing towards carbon reduction. How do we get to a net zero carbon emissions society? How do we address carbon emissions from transportation? How do we accelerate the adoption of electrified vehicles that have zero tailpipe, and the long term will have a lower carbon intensity profile than the internal combustion engines that they seek to replace? And we're starting to see some pretty assertive policies being proposed. California wants to ban the sale of internal combustion engines by 2035. Boris Johnson in the UK just accelerated their time frame. It used to be no internal combustion engine sales by 2040. February, he moved it to 2035. November, he moved it to 2030. I'm waiting for somebody to come and say next year. You know, it seems to be this one-upsmanship going on. But in that kind of scenario, how do consumers react? I mean, what can we expect consumers to do in terms of receiving this kind of information, this type of global push?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of things there. I mean, one is, I think in the short term, you perhaps won't see very much because even 2030. So if it does get to 2022, that becomes on the immediate horizon. But people, humans were very much geared to being focused on our immediate horizons. And there's a couple of things that contribute to this. One is called construal level theory. And in fact, I talked about this, I think, at the conference you had in Indianapolis a couple of years ago. Which is that things that sort of are immediate and nearby, we see in very concrete terms and are driven to action about them. But things which we see on a further horizon, we tend to kind of almost embrace a philosophical approach to. It's much more ethereal and much less concrete. So I think sort of those timelines are so distant that they probably won't sort of spark outrage or action in the near term. But when people are told what to do, it can do that. And there's a psychological effect called reactance. This is not like the reactance of electrophysics. This is kind of basically people pushing back when they feel their freedoms are being taken away. And so that's a possibility. A great example of that was, when Coke introduced New Coke in the mid 70s or 80s, and there was sort of, legions walking to their headquarters in Atlanta demanding that old Coke and classic Coke be replaced, which of course they did. Now, some skeptics, some cynics suggest that was actually a marketing ploy, but I think it was just a desire to bring something new, and people can react strongly to change. But then there's also cases where if change is mandated, people can get comfortable with it fairly quickly. And a great example of that is in the US, as you know, there's been a sort of, most attempts to launch dollar coins have been pretty abject failures. Whereas our cousins north of the border in Canada have been very successful at launching dollar coins. And one of the, and there's always, with any choice and any decision, there's so many things that factor into it. And, you mentioned lobbying earlier on. Lobbying is an important factor, sort of. So, the way that sort of the dollar coin sort of thing ran out was not just because of consumer demand. Lobbyists had a big role in the US in keeping dollar bills in circulation because the vending machine lobbyists, kind of really didn't want to have to retool their machines to use dollar coins. So, but what happened in Canada was they actually made a pretty cold, hard cut. As the dollar coins came in, they started reducing the amount of dollar bills, and they were pretty successful. They had a coin which had a picture of a loon, a bird on the back of it, so it was called the loonie. And this was actually such a successful introduction that a decade later they were able to introduce the toonie. So you have the Looney Toonies, without actually. I mean, they actually kind of withdrew the $2 bills before they actually brought in the $2 coins. So that's a case where kind of mandates can work and have a minimal effect on kind of getting people storming the hill to demand that the change doesn't happen. But I think the critical thing here really is that it's very difficult to make a judgment on this because the horizons are still quite a long way off in terms of consumer behavior, in terms of the everyday behavior of buying cars and thinking about cars. 2035 is, almost a lifetime away. And a lot can happen in that time as well. I mean, we can see, if electric cars in the meantime become even more of a norm, then that might also dilute people's reactance to this because they're actually not reacting to such a change in behavior. The status quo has changed, and the status quo has become a world where there are more electric cars.
Let's explore that a little bit, because take policy aside, take a ban or a mandate aside. We've done the analysis at the Fuels Institute that left to their own devices, it is going to take decades for consumers to start purchasing enough electric vehicles to flip the market. What goes through a person's mind when they're trying to decide from, this is what I've been driving for 40 years, this is something new. It is equivalent in terms of performance. It has these bells and whistles, but it's new. It's different. How do people process that new choice? That's really, I call it a substitute, because it's not something new. People like to say, you know what? It's like the smartphone. The smartphone was revolutionary. It was new. It wasn't replacing anything really. The EV is replacing something that's been tried and true. So what goes through? How do consumers come to a decision and make that choice?
Yeah, and as you say, it's there's an important distinction between a substitute and an alternative, which is what this might be. And I think, decision making is very, very complex. I mean, and I am biased in my perspective because I live in California, where hybrids and electric vehicles are much more of a norm. So I kind of see that emerging, and we 2.5 years ago actually took out a lease on a BMW i3. In fact, there was a second one we took out. We've had BMW i3s now for about 4 years, sorry. And part of that was, I think, we saw other people around us doing it. And of course, there are incentives. So one of the things is that does factor into this is people feeling they're making a smart choice. And a smart choice can come from many, many different factors. So just taking our particular choice, there was a number of things there. One was the rebates that we got. Another was, we were concerned about the environment. So there's a lot of identity wrapped up in it. And the other is a really kind of, one of the things you and I have talked about in the past is people doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. And I would unabashedly say that part of our choice was actually doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. It is the ability to glide down the high occupancy vehicle lane while everybody else is stuck at peak time because we're driving, or one of us is driving an electric vehicle. So I think I think it's probably not going to come down. It's going to come down to very context specific things in different places. It's going to come down to different factors for different people. But one of the things is going to be kind of that it's really going to be a whole package of things that actually kind of tips you over the edge to make the choice. Very seldom do we make a choice because we just have a massive epiphany and we switch behavior. Behavior change often comes in, an attitude change comes in small fragments that actually add up to something that kind of moves us from taking one position and adopting one choice to adopting another. One of the critical things, I talk about this a lot, is the importance of, if you're in the business of trying to get people to adopt new behaviors, often we feel we've got to get people to change 100%. And that's actually a very difficult thing for people, because there is more pain in complete change than there is in partial change. And so one of the things which was really important for us was we were not going to get a total electric, 100% electric car, because we weren't ready to make that change. So we got a BMW i3 with a range extender. And that is a genius kind of thing, because it makes the change. I mean, that may not sort of be a replacement for the roar and smell of kerosene of a internal combustion engine, but it does take away, it does reduce one of those issues, which is range anxiety, and and allows you to feel comfort in knowing that there are still, along most roads and highways, an adequate supply of gas stations. So I think, if I would like to see more of those in the move towards these 2035 goals. I think kind of getting people gradually on board would be a smarter thing than just saying this is a cutoff point. Are there ways that they can work with vehicle manufacturers? I mean, hybrids is a good example, although I think hybrids count as having a tailpipe, so they would, that's correct, isn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
But the idea of of helping people feel they're not making a complete change is a very powerful thing.
And, I've always thought that too. I always thought the plug-in hybrid was a transitional thing to help people get over their range anxiety, help them ease into the new technology. But you look at the sales. Now, granted, it is very well influenced by Tesla, which only produces EVs, but electric vehicle sales in 2019 shot up, whereas plug-in hybrid electric vehicle sales dropped. So you're seeing this switch. And for the automakers, they need to comply with regulations, but to build a plug-in hybrid is kind of like building two cars in one.
Yeah, of course.
It's a costly endeavor. But I think, you said you were doing the right thing for the wrong reasons. One of the other discussions that's going on is all about autonomous vehicles, ride-hailing services. And I've talked about this a lot. The love affair with the vehicle seems to have gone away. And we've started to move into a commoditization of transportation.
Yeah.
At the same time, if I remember correctly from some of the stuff you've written, what vehicle you drive kind of is an external expression of who you are. Are we starting to lose that, or is that still a fundamental concern?
That's a good question. I can't point to any hard data, but I think if you look at sort of what is becoming, whereas in my youth, the badge was the car you drove. I mean, and I'm talking about, sort of Ford Capris and Ford Cortina 1600Es and Triumph Stags and cars like that from, from England and Ireland in the 1970s. And that's kind of what people wanted to get to. But I think you're absolutely right. I think other things have become much more important. Experiences have become more important. Another thing is, mobile device. Kind of a badge that we have now is kind of having the latest iPhone. Wearing, as I'm doing the wrong way around, my Apple earbuds. I was looking for the chance to switch them around because they don't really work the other way around as well. But so I think that's actually a very good cultural observation, which is that people are less defined by cars than they were. They're more defined by, as I said, experiences, by having, by being ahead of the game in terms of accessing services and stuff like that. And that does mean that even the idea of car ownership becomes a less strong bond than it has been in the past.
Now, you also mentioned that one of the things that made you comfortable getting into the electrified vehicle space was your surroundings. You're familiar with it. You see it around it. Mm-hmm. And I've used that reference a lot, is that people become comfortable with stuff with which they're familiar. And so if you're in Silicon Valley area, you're going to see a lot of electric vehicles. If you are in the middle of Montana, you're not. And that kind of familiarity. So I've always said there's familiarity, there's a proof of concept, and capabilities. So right now we've got a population, some who are interested, they're familiar with it, they know what an electric vehicle is, but they're not necessarily asking for it, or they go to a dealership and the dealership's not offering it because they don't have any on the lot. What are the various if we're going to try to see a market accelerate, what are the things that are most important when consumers are trying to make these decisions?
Well, and I think you hit on something. And I know a number of car firms, and I would almost call car manufacturing outliers, have looked at this, but an electric pickup is, I think, going to be a very significant thing, because at the moment, electric vehicles are, a privileged, elitist thing, because partly because of the cars that they are.
Yeah.
And so I think sort of, getting that, I don't know if you call it format or sort of whatever you call an electric vehicle, but getting that type to cars which are driven by a larger chunk of the population, and also finding ways to demonstrate their performance. I mean, I think sort of, Formula One moving to hybrid motors, to hybrid engines, actually sort of had a effect on people's perception of what an electric vehicle could do, or what an electrified vehicle could do. I think as well, sort of an understanding. One of the messages which I do not see at all in the world of EVs is the power of electric engines, the power of electric motors. I mean, if you want torque, look no further than electric. Yeah, exactly.
Right. No, it is interesting, because when I look at the next 5 to 10 years, the number of EV models coming on the market is astounding. And I saw a report recently, by 2030, 3/4 of the EVs produced in the US will be light trucks and utility vehicles, which is what people are buying. They're buying trucks and utility vehicles. And I've always said, if you want a technology to take off in the vehicle space, you have to build it within the vehicle.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, that was part of the genius of Tesla. I mean, we have a BMW i3, and it kind of looks more like a golf cart than a car.
Right, it does.
But a Tesla looks like, the original Tesla was a Lotus, for goodness sake. I mean, it's a sports car. And I think that's a really critical thing, which is aligning the format with people's identity. And at the moment, the format is aligned with an identity like mine, which is kind of, hey, I'm kind of, sort of a greenie sitting here in the Bay Area in California. Whereas I think to be successful, it needs the idea, the concept of electric vehicles needs to align with different identities and much broader identities than that. And this is really important.
That all feeds into kind of a primary tenet in your book, and that is the influence of instinct. It's not so much people are research everything they do. They don't always make rational decisions. And a lot of times, and what I picked up on, I've used a lot of times, is people will research to justify and feel good about the decision they already made. But the decision was not necessarily predicated on research and knowledge, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, I think, sort of Baba Shiv has a professor at Stanford has a great quote, which is essentially, and I'll get it slightly wrong, but it's that, our rational brain simply rationalizes what our intuitive brain has already decided to do. So it's not to say that rational information isn't important. As you say, it can support our intuitions, but it has to do a lot of work to overcome our intuitions. And I think there was an interesting thread a couple of minutes ago where we were talking about the notion of identity, because identity is something you kind of feel. You don't rationalize your identity, but it is a really critical thing, because if you feel that buying something or adopting a behavior is actually is working against your identity, is undermining your identity in some way, then you avoid those behaviors. And you will equally, of course, embrace behaviors that you feel support that identity. We are kind of really, we are stalwart defenders of our identity. Because it's so important to us. I mean, we wake up every day and our identity is a suit of armor that helps us get through the day. So kind of when we feel that others are attacking it, or indeed we might do things that undermine it in some way, we avoid those things. So I think a really critical thing, and it will come about as we see EVs moving into different formats and different car types, is this notion of how do you align it with different types of identity. And it seems like that's what's happening, but of course, bringing a new car to market takes a long time. There are obviously sort of substantial design and technology and engineering issues. But that is really the critical thing. It's kind of like, if people see an EV not as representing my identity, but actually representing their identity, which could be, here is a pickup truck which has got, which has got the greatest torque of any, sort of pickup truck, which, I think those then become very, very powerful messages. It becomes, how do you align the proof points, which are, to an identity, which is an emotional thing.
And I think, over the next several years, here's where I think the tipping point is. Electric vehicles will be offered in the type of vehicle that customers want to buy. They'll provide 300 to 400 mile range per charge. They'll be able to recharge in under 10 to 15 minutes. They will provide great performance, lower cost of ownership. They'll be price competitive without tax credits. Yeah. Now the customer has a choice. And now it's not about rationalizing, talking yourself into it. Now it's about picking the vehicle that you like the most, that fits who you want to be the most. Yeah. And that's coming in the next 5 years.
Yeah. And that's a critical thing as well, because, and there's a lot of interesting work done on sort of the role of having many choices versus few. Famous experiments show that when people are drawn to a display which has many choices, but actually they are more likely to buy from a curated set, a smaller choice set. But at the end of the day, we like to feel we have a choice. And I think one of the issues with EVs to date has been there hasn't been a like-for-like choice in many places. If you want a certain kind of car, it's not like you can say, I want to get this one, this one, or this one. It was kind of like with hybrids. It was like a Prius for the first 10 years of hybrids existence. If you want to buy a high-end electric car, sure, there are some BMWs there, but really it's a Tesla. And so I think this is what you've described as a very positive thing, to actually sort of allowing people to feel it is their choice rather than a choice that is being thrust upon them. If the mandates in 2035 would say you've got to have an electric car and it doesn't matter which one it is, it's got to be this one, then that is clearly taking away people's choice. But if people can feel that they still, within this regulation, have sufficient choice to get something which reflects their identity and, of course, their needs, then we may be in a good place.
No, I think, that you mentioned pickup trucks, and there's a truck coming out. There's several trucks coming on the market in the next year or two. One in particular, I saw the specs on it released about 2 weeks ago. I think it has like a 10 to 15,000 pound towing capacity. Okay. It's an electric vehicle, has a 3-foot water portage rate. It means you can go put through 3 feet of water.
Yeah.
Now, look, I'm going to be flippant here.
Without having to have one of those fancy funnels up the.
Right. You don't need a snorkel.
Yeah.
But I'm, being flippant. Do I really want to drive a high-powered electric computer through 3 feet of water? Now, clearly, that's going to be safe. It's not an issue. But that's the type of stuff that people are going to be looking at. That vehicle outperforms the traditional pickup truck I've been driving. Yeah. And it's more expensive, but eventually it won't be. And I think that is really where we're going to start seeing that change. Because right, people will have choice. They'll have options. They won't be bucketed into certain categories where most people buying electric vehicles are doing it for economic reasons. They're doing it for commute reasons. They're doing it for environmental reasons. They're doing it for identity reasons. Yeah. Once it becomes a option, I think that changes everything quite a bit.
Yeah, for sure. Yes, I think, and it's almost like moving away from the notion that it becomes about things you can do with this. It becomes how it fits into your life. And as I said, how it kind of fits into your identity as well. I mean, that is, I think, going to be, that's a classic role for marketing for the car manufacturers. And they've typically been pretty good at kind of figuring out what their segments are and what their segments like and how their segments feel. So I think as well, another factor in this is having large car manufacturers really involved in the category and bringing the full weight of what they know about brands and what they know about human motivations to bear as well.
And I think that's coming quick. The leader so far has been Tesla, which produces only electric vehicles. It has its niche. They did brilliant. They made an aspirational brand, and then they made a more affordable brand that people could get into. But I think once we get mass production from the traditional automakers and they start cranking out multiple versions of their electric powertrains, then I think people's eyes are going to open up and go, wait a second. And at that point, government requirements may not be necessary.
Sure, that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Government doesn't like to hear that they're irrelevant. but I'm hoping that the technology and the capabilities and the options compel consumers to look at this as a viable option, and hopefully puts off government mandate, government control.
Yeah.
I never
How do you see this affecting the retail refueling business? I mean, that obviously infrastructure has to grow in line with this as well.
Yes, you have about 150,000 retail gasoline stations in the United States. You don't need 150,000 gas stations selling electrons, because what you're going to have is a diversity of places where you can recharge. You can recharge at home, recharge at the office, recharge at a gas station or convenience store, recharge at a supermarket, recharge at a shopping mall, recharge at a restaurant. Charging is going to be almost ubiquitously available at some point in different venues. There's not going to be a lack of charging. For the convenience retailer, however, we've been preaching, look, your customer today comes in, buys a tank of gas, comes in the store, buys a cup of coffee, buys a soda, buys a meal, then they leave. So that night they go out and they buy an electric vehicle. If you don't offer electric service, charging services, they're not going to feel like you care about them. You need to be offering both, because EVs are going to gain market share. Customers are going to continue on their patterns of travel. Whether they're charging at home or not, they're going to occasionally be looking for a recharging opportunity in the market. You need to be an option, because the computers in the EVs list where all the chargers are. If you're not on that list, then you're not in their brain anymore. And so you really need to figure out, provide the electric charging services when the market dictates it's viable, but also focus on the inside offer, because you need to become a destination for that home charger. You need to have them want to come to your store, not for energy. And so it's going to be a different mindset. And I started working in the convenience industry in 2000, so 20 years ago. And the market's so different than it was 20 years ago. And in 10 years, it's going to be so different again. So it's going to be an interesting dynamic, but there's an opportunity here. I think what I'm hearing from some segments of the market, though, is we're not putting chargers in because that'll facilitate the transition to EVs. We keep hearing that limited infrastructure is an impediment to selling EVs. Well, we don't want to fix that. Well, that's foolish. Somebody's going to fix it. And you might as well be part of the solution rather than sitting with your head in the sand.
And you know, I mean, from a behavioral perspective, I would suggest that the convenience store and the forecourt industry is actually well placed in terms of their brand and what they mean to people and how they can match this. I mean, they have a behavioral leg up because this is what people do already.
Right.
And so it's much easier to get people to follow a behavior and adapt a behavior a bit than to adopt an entirely new behavior.
People are creatures, you know that better than I do, but I've seen data that most people refuel their vehicles at maybe 3 locations. Most people are recharging their vehicles at 3 or 4 locations. We go to the same place for the same thing over and over and over again. If they're coming to your store to buy gas and they need to buy electrons, you want them to come to your store to buy electrons, and they want to come to your store to do that. They don't want to change behavior. We don't like change. Nobody does.
And the industry and your members have you know, put billions of dollars into creating the brands that actually facilitate that. So for me, from my perspective, it would be a waste of that brand equity, both in terms of the owners of the brands, but also the consumers, the people out there who have in their minds these brands and associate them with that behavior. So it's kind of like by not doing it, I would argue they are doing a disservice to themselves and their shareholders, but also to the consumers who've used them for that in the past, because it is costly, it is cognitively costly to develop new behaviors. The more you can do to reduce that, I think it's better. One of the things I talk about is how a role of marketing is about making choice easy, natural, and rewarding. And that is a win both for the chooser, as I like to call the consumer. I don't like to call them consumers because marketing is about choice, but that's a win for the chooser and a win for the company offering the services as well. Because when a choice is easy, you as a brand are more likely to get it if you've made the choice easier. If you've made it feel natural, that means it feels good. And if it's rewarding, I mean rewarding both for the chooser and for the marketing organization as well.
That's a great point. You've invested in your brand. You take a look at the major global oil companies. They're changing to become energy companies. They're offering electric vehicle charging services. They're buying into that. But you invest in a brand and you establish brand loyalty. You need to manage that brand. You need to manage that relationship with your choosers. And even if their preferences are changing, you need to evolve with them. I think it's a huge point that needs to really be heard and people need to be paying attention to.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really, I mean, it is an interesting sea change, but I mean, you know, these are, I mean, the best companies embrace these and move with them. And to your point about facilitating, being concerned about facilitating the enemy, I think there's anybody who's been watching The Crown will have had a reminder of Margaret Thatcher's very kind of hardline approach on things. But I think one of the things she said to some of her cabinet ministers was that if you don't like change, consider the alternative, which is extinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's a leading company in the convenience industry. Their mantra is, we want to be the company that puts our existing company out of business.
Yeah.
And that means staying on top and staying in front and really thinking about it. So Matthew, great catching up again.
Nice to see you as well.
I'm going to recommend everybody out there, order this.
Thank
Where
you
can
very
they
much.
get your book, Matthew? Where can they get it?
You can get it on Amazon.com or any good online bookseller. You can buy it on Kindle as well. And you know, if people like it, I really appreciate them jotting a few lines down on the place where they bought it, just to give a review, because first of all, what we know is that reviews actually help us kind of feel better about our choices. So by leaving a review, you're going to feel better about buying the book. And secondly, it may influence other people to do it as well.
Well, it's a great read. It really has helped me a little bit more about how people make choices. And I really appreciate everything you've done and all the time you spent with us at the Field Sense. So Matthew,
excellent.
Happy holidays, and let's stay in touch.
Same to you. Cheers. Bye-bye. Bye.